Hi, Tens. So in this collection of videos, I'm just going to be going through some important concepts that I want you just to revise as we sort of progress into term two. So first of all, topic one is just looking at introduction to what economics means. Um, so there's just some examples of some big economic stories which we're going to talk about throughout the year, but I'm not going to focus on them now. So economics is a study of choices. Okay, so at its root, it's a study of how an economy uses its allocates its scarce resources, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. But how we allocate our scarce resources to satisfy consumers' unlimited wants and needs. So we have a certain limited or finite amount of resources, and our aim is to use those resources to maximise the needs and wants of society. So the aim of all economies is to maximise the living standards of citizens, and to do that we need to use our productive resources, which is our land, labour, and capital, which again we'll talk about in a sec, as efficiently as possible to try and maximise growth and maximise our living standards. The aim of the economy is to use our scarce resources to maximise growth and maximise our living standards. Now, there are some assumptions we make when we're talking about economic agents. So when you see the word economic agents, we're talking about basically all the main players in an economy. So consumers, businesses, producers, the government are all examples of economic agents. But essentially what we're trying to do is we're assuming that they're all rational, which means that they're all acting in their own self-interest. So consumers want to buy products, best quality products at the lowest prices, and producers want to make as much profit as possible by selling products at a high price generally, to make as much money as possible. So rational economic agents will try and maximize their net benefit, which means they want to have a bigger gap as possible between the benefits of the transaction and the costs of a transaction. And we also state that economic agents will only do something if the net benefits exceed the net costs. So when you're weighing up whether to buy a certain product, you weigh up the net benefits and the net costs, and you're only likely to proceed with that transaction if the benefits exceed the costs. Okay, so there's two branches of economics, and we talked about this in class. There's microeconomics and macroeconomics. So microeconomics is looking at all the small parts that make up an economy. So we'd be looking at individual labour markets, for example. So we might be looking at the market for teachers or for builders or for plumbers, um, market for DVDs, oil markets, water, ice. So there's a range of different markets that operate in the economy, and microeconomics looks at how those markets allocate resources and to decide on what goods and services we're going to produce. So it might look at sort of the production cost within a business or the profitability of a certain industry. So we're looking at the studying economic behaviour of individuals as consumers, but also businesses on a micro level. Macroeconomic Macroeconomics is looking at the economy as a whole. So we're looking at aggregate levels of production. We're looking at how the economy is performing as a whole, and that can look at things like the level of economic growth. So you'll hear words in the news like recessions. Are we heading towards a recession? Are we in a peak in the business cycle, which means economic growth is really strong? We look at issues that we'll talk about in later videos like inflation, unemployment, national production, all these sort of aggregate measures of performance. So micro, individual basis, small parts of the economy, production costs and prices within industries, looking at particular sectors, looking at how individual markets allocate resources, whereas macro is like a bird's eye look at the economy. So how the economy is performing as a whole in terms of economic growth, inflation, unemployment, spending, etc., and equity, which we'll also focus on. So there's just some examples. So if we're looking at builders, this would be a microeconomic issue. Job vacancies as a whole, because it doesn't mention a particular industry, that's a macro issue. Increasing hours of overtime, again, it's macro because it's not mentioning a specific industry. Homelessness, macro issue. Demand for steel is micro. Long-term unemployment, again, it doesn't specify an industry, so it's a macro thing. This one's about cars, so it's micro. Pizzas, micro. Profits in the airline industry is a micro thing. Whereas something like consumers are hit by delay in product delivery, again, not mentioning a specific industry, so it's a macro concern. Real take-home incomes is a macro concern. Australia's level of debt's a macro concern. Where lipstick sales, share prices are all micro things. So basically, as I said to you at the start, the idea of economics is to maximize our needs and wants. So we use our resources to maximize our needs and wants. What we mean by that is our needs are the things that are necessary for survival. So we're looking at things like food, clothing, shelter, all the things we need to survive. In wealthy countries, a lot of people would list things like mobile phones as a need because it allows you to generate an income and carry out about your job. Um, whereas that wouldn't necessarily be a need in the less developed country. Wants, these are things we need above our needs for our we don't need them for survival, but they're just things that we want to make our lives better. So the idea is that relative scarcity is the concept that all countries have an infinite or limitless amount of needs and wants, where we have a limited amount of resources. So our needs and wants are infinite or limitless, whereas our resources, land, labor, and capital, are limited or finite. So finite means limited. So the problem that all countries face is we have unlimited wants and needs, but limited resources. And because of that, we need to make choices. So when we're talking about relative scarcity, it can face different people. So individuals can face relative scarcity when they're working out where to allocate their scarce labor resources, what they want to do for the rest of their lives. So producers, when they're trying to work out the best way to produce. So are we going to use our land to make bananas? Or are we going to use it for mangoes? The government faces scarcity because they have a limited amount of funds, and they need to work out where they're going to allocate those funds as well. So essentially, we're talking about this idea of resources or factors of production. So resources are scarce or limited, whereas our wants and needs are unlimited. So our resources that also refer to as factors of production. So they're basically inputs that allow us to produce goods and services. So all the land, labor, and capital that we use in the production process to try and generate goods and services. So our resources are limited or finite. We only have a certain amount of workers, a certain amount of machines, a certain amount of land. So we have to make choices about how we're going to allocate or use those scarce resources. So each of the four factors of production is scarce, and we need to make choices as an economy about how we're going to use those scarce resources. So we can't produce an unlimited number of goods and services. We have to make choices. So the four factors of production, you've got land, that's just all natural resources. So fresh water, oil, forests, oceans, coal, anything that's not made by humans, essentially, that's used in the production process. That's really important. If we're not using land to make stuff, then it's not classified as a factor of production. Labor resources, so they're the people power. So your plumbers, builders, teachers, fashion designers. It's all the mental and physical effort to produce goods and services. Um, Capital resources, we're talking about all the man-made stuff. So the buildings, the factories, the equipment, tractors, cars, etc., that are used to produce goods and services. It's really important to recognize that capital resources must be used to make other goods and services that are aiming to generate income. So, for example, if it's a car, but it's a car that's being sold, that's not a capital resource because it's not being used to generate production. So my car, for example, I'm not using that to generate production, so it's not a capital resource. But if we're using a car like an Uber driver or someone who's delivering pizzas, that car's being used in the production process, so therefore it's a capital resource. And your last one, entrepreneurs, they're your owners and risk takers in the production process. So their idea is to manage all the other resources with the intention of making a profit going forward. So I'll talk about this in the next video.